My name is Jerry Ravetz, and I am more than just a professor.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Both Sides Now, the conversation series. I got to know Professor Ravetz actually through my mother. She's known Mrs. Ravetz for years and told me that Professor Ravetz is an amazing professor. But I thought, this is Oxford, and there are plenty of professors. I googled him anyway, and conveniently, Professor Ravetz has written his own website. He's both a mathematician, but also a philosopher. So one looks for solutions, and the other creates more abstract ideas. He's not just a professor of the history of philosophy. He was an associate fellow at the Oxford University Institute of Science, Innovation and Society. So looking at the past and the future. He's American, but has lived in the UK for a very long time. The website also says that he was born in 1929, but he doesn't look a day older than 70. If I put my lawyer hat on, it looks like there are two witness statements, each describing a different person who definitely needs to be examined. If I put my neuroscientist hat on, I just want to know how his mind works. We only got to scratch the surface in this video, but I feel so privileged to be able to meet Professor Ravetz and his wife, Judy.
Childhood. So I was born in 1929, grew up in the 30s near Philadelphia, a town called Camden, which was then an industrial town. My grandfather was a Russian Jewish immigrant who became a prosperous greengrocer. My father was a highly intelligent man, a bit of a tearaway, and the years I was growing up, he was he was a very prosperous worker, drove a truck for an industrial laundry, and man of tremendous intelligence and huge energy, quite charismatic, and so he ran the truck and he worked for the trade union, helped to organize the Teamsters Union in Camden, for which I've always been very proud, and we lived in a neighborhood of a few new homes, largely middle-class Jewish, next to a large neighborhood of lower middle-class and working-class people. So the school I went to, the Jews were a very small minority, and I experienced some anti-Semitism, but I realized, and perhaps this is characteristic of me, I was actually quite good friends with some boys who I knew didn't like Jews. And one day I realized one reason why they didn't like Jews is that we had leather shoes.
Oh.
And they only had cotton sneakers. See? We lived in houses with central heating. They had kerosene stoves. And all the rest of it. So it wasn't such that we had a religion that was different. We were intrusion of a social class of privilege. We moved around quite a lot, and I was always quite reflective. I was aware of politics from a very young age, and I remember finding great difficulty in going through this ceremony of pledging allegiance to the flag, because it concluded with the phrase liberty and justice for all, and I knew quite well that there was not liberty and justice, particularly for the Negro people, as well as the Indians and all the others, and poor people. So I was aware of myself in a way, personally and socio-politically, in a way which I think not very many kids are. And I always knew I was different. And so I think it was because of that that I had the sort of trajectory that I did. We moved around a lot as my father changed jobs. I had several years living in Birmingham, Alabama, which was then a segregated city.
Yeah.
So I can say I actually rode on a segregated bus. So, something to say I've done that. And in fact, when I got back to Philadelphia, went to Central High School, the academic high school, I eventually realized that, I'm academically pretty smart. I didn't know what to do about going to college. It was a rather complicated story, but one day somebody a bit older than me said, he says, there's this Quaker college called Swarthmore near to Philadelphia, but he says they have a very strict Jewish quota. And I then, one of the few times I've reacted as a Jewish person, I said, it's worth trying to get into. So,
but how did you get into mathematics?
And I'll tell you in a minute. At this stage, my maths was good, but, not much better than good. And so I got to Swarthmore. I fell in love with the place. As soon as I walked onto the campus, I felt I've come home. I had 4 wonderful, wonderful years there. Liked economics. I thought of changing my major. And my father, this was then in the later 40s, and my father said, look, you want to be an academic? If you're a scientist, you can keep your opinions to yourself. If you go into something like economics, you'll never get a job. And he was right. See?
Wow.
So I stuck to the maths, but then began to feel all sorts of things about the way this was taught I didn't like. I remember actually trying to find books in the library of history of science. And on the other hand, when I studied philosophy, I found it totally unsatisfactory.
Right.
It didn't help me. I don't have a real philosopher's temperament.
What is a real philosopher's temperament?
Of finding intellectual puzzles about concepts interesting in themselves.
But isn't that also mathematics?
Well, no, because the mathematics, you take the concepts for granted.
Right.
Mathematics are just plumbers like everybody, mathematicians. This was a big lesson for me. I stuck to science, got a good degree, got to Cambridge, and it was all a comedy of accidents, but I wound up doing a PhD in mathematics.
And what was your PhD thesis about?
It was about,
Will we understand?
Very briefly, if you've done the calculus, okay, and the calculus, when you do these rates of change, it always assumes that the function is smooth enough to have a rate of change. But if you say, suppose the function has lots and lots of bumps, even going down to the infinitely small, and you cannot simply say, I have a first and second derivative. What can you say? That was the area that my supervisor worked in. So this is totally pure, totally useless.
Do you know, it reminds me of my cousin, because I asked him the same thing. He did his DPhil. He was top of his class by such a great margin, like 20 marks margin, that he could pretty much fail his last year and still get a first. But he then proceeded to do DPhil at Merton. And the first thing that I asked him was, obviously, what's your thesis about? And he said it's useless. But that's the key question, right? Because we often think about maths as someone who is very good at arithmetic.
Yes.
And therefore you can apply your maths and make a lot of money, like going into banking, going into these abstract financial products and make a ton of money.
Yeah.
how did you go from this mathematics abstract mind to philosophy?
Okay. I always saw mathematics. Well, I had decided I wanted to do a PhD, to have an experience of research in science before I began philosophizing about it. Because it seemed to me that the philosophers of science didn't know any science. That was wrong, in fact, but anyway. So I found myself through a succession of accidents doing the maths rather than physics for a PhD. But I then took it as philosophical. I mean, I knew I never loved it.
Maths or philosophy?
Maths.
Yeah.
And I knew this is something I have to do to learn how to do it and what it's all about. So I had this experience. I mean, life was quite turbulent in all sorts of ways. I got my PhD. It was a good PhD. I got a job. I was married to my first wife. And at a certain stage I said, hey, wait a minute. I didn't want to be a mathematician all my life anyway. And so I then began contacting around quite deliberately to jump. And I had this great good fortune that somebody put me in touch with a young, brilliant, radical philosophy of science professor who was just then building a school at Leeds where he had the full backing of the Vice-Chancellor and a tap line to the Leverhulme Foundation. And so I met Stephen Toulmin. Pretty quickly he said, would you like to come and work with me? I said yes. And he went to the Vice-Chancellor. The Vice-Chancellor phoned up Leverhulme.
But was it as simple as that? Has he told you afterwards what he saw in you?
Well, first of all, yeah, I was a very interesting guy with a Cambridge PhD, so I couldn't be stupid. And I was interesting, well-travelled and a good conversationalist and willing to come in and help build the school.
But build a school in philosophy, which
history and philosophy of science, which didn't exist.
Right.
So, I mean, well, in the sense that there were people doing history of science, but most of it was rather pedestrian. There were people doing philosophy of science, most of it was rather abstract and irrelevant. Okay. So he wanted to create sort of a hybrid subject where the history was informed by philosophy and the philosophy was checked by history.
So in other words, can we say that he sees you as a bridge?
Well, yeah.
He can do both.
I think he saw me as an interesting guy. We were pioneering.
Right, yeah.
And he wasn't looking for qualifications, he was looking for people. Then things were turbulent again, and he had all sorts of personal stuff, and he left. And there were a few of us there, but clearly I was the one who, if anyone, could lead it forward. And the Vice-Chancellor called me in and said, it's all yours.
It sounded so simple, but
just like
I'm
that.
sure
he was that sort of person, a great dynamic leader. And then at the time he said, now, do you want to try to build a research school which will publish lots of papers and get a reputation, or do you want to bring your subject to the surface of the university? I said, I'll take option B. He said, I'll back you. And so over the next few years, I kept an eye out for interesting young scholars. And we got them. So through the 60s, we had a very vibrant, very exciting school. We were in a sort of dialogue with Marxism to some extent, because there was really interesting work being done by Marxist historians on the 17th century. And it was interesting and provocative, but historically incorrect. And so we spent a lot of time sort of correcting and enriching that.
in your abstract mind, how do you explain to people your way of working?
I tend to work more like a historian. The abstract style of investigating real-world problems can be very misleading because the temptation to make your model stand for the reality is too great. In fact, the work I did in my second great phase with Silvio Fontevich, it wound up with post-normal science, but on the way we did an analysis of, the book was called Uncertainty and Quality in Science for Policy, which was a much neglected book. It was a very, very good book. So I've always been, and I think this was where the history, I loved the history because I tended to distrust abstract formalisms. And people always assume, well, I'm a mathematician who likes philosophy, I must be doing logic. No, because logic is a formal system itself, and which will be hopefully representing complex realities, but also misleading them, you see.
You said you grew up in a Jewish family.
Yeah.
How did that impact you both on the culture and the religious side and science?
This is very interesting because in my particular, at the time I was growing up, I would say outside of a very few communities, the American Jewish population was very secular and really had abandoned the religion. And I saw little bits of it, and they didn't impress me at all. Now, since then, the religion has actually had a sort of a renaissance. My elder sister, died. As she grew up, she sort of, as it were, rejoined the faith. Not fanatically, but socially and believing, and her children are all observant to some degree. And of course, this made quite a stimulating culture clash, because Judy grew up in an observant Jewish community. You know, to be Jewish, you don't have to believe in the same way that a Christian has to believe.
How so?
Well, if you're a Christian, means you believe that Jesus is in some way your savior and all the rest of it, you know. If you're Jewish, well, there's a Jewish people. And they were very special, obviously. Were they God's chosen people? Well, you don't have to do it. It's like that. So you know it is as much social and historical. It's a community. Yes. On the other hand, you do have a history, a community, and an intellectual style. And certainly among the American Jews, a very strong commitment to social justice.
How did you go from then all these amalgamation of science, knowledge, religion, or culture, to moving kind of forward to science innovation in Oxford?
Well,
I can understand that you need to,
I know.
You need to do the
that was
background.
Actually, that's a bit misleading. What happened there was I had an old friend who was active in the whole science in society field, who came to Oxford. He was a distinguished scholar, actually described himself as an undisciplined social scientist. And so he had a chair here with an institute. And the institute was first called Science and Civilization. And then all sorts of academic horrors happened, and he wound up Science, Innovation and Society. and he invited me to join as an associate. I never worried about disciplines, and I think that's the answer.
There's sort of a limit to what you can do and what you can think.
I know I'm not a biologist.
But you can be.
But, in a sense, I could, let's say I was a member of the Genetic Manipulation Advisory Group. Yeah. So I was dealing with biological problems. So in a sense, I was a good citizen scientist.
When you meet young people at university, because of your wealth of knowledge and experiences, how do you understand their immediate concerns or issues, or being an activist because they see something on the news? Do you think it according to your experience, or do you try to understand that they are 17?
Well, I suppose I remembered the mistakes I made. I mean, there are some things like the woke culture, which I find difficult to comprehend. And I just say they're young and they're trying out, and if they do a lot of harm, they do a lot of harm.
So what do you still read up on the news? What still interests you?
Science and society issues, climate emergency, COVID emergency. I'm quite interested in broad cultural, historical things. I've had I can't call it a major concern, but a long-standing interest in China and Chinese culture. I taught London too. I taught in Shanghai.
Yes.
And of course that was right. There was the boy we saw. And so.
Are you tempted to go back to the US?
No. I stopped being American long ago. And I think in recent decades I've settled down.
In next week's video, find out how destiny brought Professor Ravetz and his wife Judy together and settled down in the UK.
When he came at the door, I thought, it's familiar. I don't know, this guy's familiar, but I don't quite know where. And as soon as he came into the kitchen, behind an enormous bunch of flowers, came into the kitchen, I suddenly realised who he was. And he was the guy from the bus stop on the other side of the road. And my friend had told me to forget all about him. And there he was. So that was that was really quite extraordinary.